Hey, let's try this. No, just kidding. I'm not going to teach you more Dutch words, but words do matter. So initially, this was titled Data-Driven Postmortems. My friend Jason Hand up here in front convinced me that I should change it to Data-Driven Incident Reviews, because postmortems often have a negative connotation. But before we do that, a little bit about myself. I'm a technical writer and evangelist at Datadog. I boil that down to my job role is docs and talks. So I write technical documentation. I read through our code base to figure out what's going on with our APIs, and then I inform developers about that. And I also just come to events like this, and I talk. Beyond that, I am a travel hacker. I like to fly around for no reason in particular, just to earn miles. And I'm usually a whiskey hunter, although usually in the Netherlands, I'm a Jenever hunter, so had a fair bit of that last night at the party. A little bit about Datadog. If you're not familiar with Datadog, we're a SaaS-based monitoring platform, so we essentially handle all the heavy lifting of doing metrics for you. Makes it easy. With our thousands of customers, we end up processing over several trillion points of data every day. And we are hiring, so if you're looking for some new opportunities doing interesting, creative work, both back-end, front-end, all across the stack, we are hiring, so that's the link for that. We also are hiring in Europe. But if you were to get hired, this is what you would see. This is part of our internal developer guide. So when you onboard, you read our developer guide, gives you some ideas about how we do code styles, how we do architecture. But this actually gives a good point and says that the problems that we work on often don't have clean-cut technical solutions. So you have to troubleshoot or work on your troubleshooting skills, no matter what role you work in. And I love this statement because it applies to more than just Datadog. I think everybody out here, everybody that's here today, all the people that you work with, have to deal with challenging problems, and they need to hone their troubleshooting skills, as we all do, to figure out what went wrong and how systems break. So that leads me to this great quote by Henry Ford, the American automobile manufacturer, and he says, really, the only real mistake that we can make is the one from which we learn nothing, which is why we're all here, and we're interested in postmortems. There was an open space yesterday, and obviously my talk got selected. So I think everybody's interested in learning how can we learn from our mistakes. And we know that it's important to learn from them because not learning from our mistakes can be very, very expensive. At Datadog, we like to say that collecting data is cheap, and not having it when you need it can be very expensive. I mentioned that I'm a travel hacker, so I like to use fun examples from the travel world. People familiar with the British Airways outage that happened a couple months ago? Yeah? This is my favorite photo from that outage. Like, it was so bad, they couldn't even put information up on the displays in the airport. They had, like, whiteboards that they were writing things on. British Airways ended up canceling 800 flights. More than that, though, one of the things that I like to point out to people is we always think of when an outage happens, what's the cost to the business? And we think of that in lost opportunities like 800 flights canceled. But often we miss out on the other parts. So in the upper right-hand corner there, that's the stock price that happened. So that's their stocks. It dropped 5%. They have roughly 2 billion shares out, so that drop of 5% represents about 67 trillion euro. Right? So that's a huge number. On top of that, EU has really great laws around how you treat passengers. So on top of that, stock money is sort of fake money because, when your stock price goes up, and the loss wasn't so big. But because of those EU laws, 61 million euros had to be paid out to passengers. So when we think about the cost of not having data and not being able to understand our failures, think of the other ways that our companies might be losing money. So if we're thinking about how we can be data-driven, what sort of data should we start to collect to understand our failures? Well, at Datadog, we like to say that metrics have 4 good qualities. So you can start to collect all the data you want, but if you don't have these 4 good qualities, then the data that you're collecting may not be too useful. And the first quality of good metrics is that they have to be well understood. everybody on your team has to understand what a metric means and why it's important. As an example of this, or a negative example of this, the Mars Orbiter was a project between NASA, the US Space Agency, and Lockheed Martin, so a private company. Lockheed Martin, being an American company, traditionally uses imperial measurements, so things like pounds, feet, miles, things that are kind of strange. I'm sorry, as Americans, that we do that. Europeans, though, you're all sane, and you use things like meters and kilograms that are, nice decimal-based numbers based on orders of 10. And everyone thought they were on the same page because we should use these same numbers like kilograms. But we weren't on the same page. So calculations were made in the wrong units. The Mars Orbiter isn't orbiting Mars. It is now in a million pieces on the surface of Mars. So your metrics have to be well understood. People have to know what they mean. Your metrics should also be sufficiently granular. So last year we had the Olympics, and I particularly love the men's 50-meter freestyle. It's a really, really fast event. The numbers here are a little bit washed out, but if you can read them, pretty much everybody in this race finished within 21 seconds. And if our granularity is whole seconds, then everybody wins, except for this last guy from, I think that's Lithuania? Sorry, Lithuanians. But we understand that granularity matters. We should measure things in the swimming event by hundredths of a second. And we understand that with the metrics that we gather for our systems as well, right? As you build infrastructure, some of the things that you measure are going to be in nanoseconds or microseconds, or sometimes whole seconds. And the way that looks when we end up looking at our monitoring tools actually matters as well, because we understand that if our metrics are on granularities of 1 minute, or if we start rolling this up to 5 minutes, not only are we losing data, but we're starting to actually shift data, right? So here's some graphs. It's the exact same graph, but first 1 second, we see that the peak for a CPU here is 46%. If we roll that up to 1 minute, not only do we shift the time of when that spike happened, which will also skew when we think that an incident happened, but we also see that the peak now is only 36% because it's been averaged out. So our incident wasn't quite as bad. If we roll up to 5 minutes, well, then we shift that time again to the start of a 5-minute increment. But now we've averaged out even more, so it's only 12%. So if you want your 99.999% uptime, just aggregate it. You'll be fine. Metric quality number 3 is that they've got to be tagged and filterable, right? You have to understand that as we scale out our infrastructure, we're distributing things around the world, and we're setting up multi-tiered architectures, so we have more servers, and understanding where your metrics comes from you can only do that when you start to tag, and you can only see the data that you need when you can filter on that. So if we think about a metric point, we need to think of it not only as what it was and how much it was and when it was, but start to think about tagging. Start to think of your metrics in terms of where did it come from, what application was it a part of, so that when you have your metrics, you can start to query against them and do things like show me the CPU from availability zone in Western Europe versus Eastern Europe on a, if I'm running an AWS on a, M3 large that's part of my database application. So you can start to query against your metrics as if they were a database, which is really helpful. And then finally, your metrics need to be long-lived, so you have to keep your metrics around. I know it's expensive, or we think it's expensive to store things, but it's actually super cheap, all right? S3, cold storage, throw them somewhere where you can actually keep them, and then if you need to look back, you can. But looking back will provide you the patterns and the understanding of how you're doing not only last week, but how you're doing last quarter, how you're doing year over year. It gives you a baseline for understanding your systems and how your systems are evolving. So once we have all those metrics, we like to think of them in sort of 2 buckets, with events being a third one. So we gather up these metrics with these 4 good qualities. And the first way that we like to think of metrics is by work metrics. Your work metrics are the important metrics. These are the things that you should be getting paged on. They're things that are important to the business. Work metrics are things like throughput and successes, or generally how the performance is going. I love donuts. So in the example of a donut factory, work metrics are how many donuts are coming off the line. If I have a donut factory, how many of them are properly glazed where I can actually sell them? How many of them are broken, they're partially glazed, and I have to throw them in the bin? Resource metrics are unfortunately the ones that a lot of people send alerts on, and that's why we have alert fatigue. Resource metrics are the things that are on our systems. They're things like how much CPU is being utilized, what's my disk I/O. Resource metrics for a donut factory would be things like how much sugar do I have, how much flour do I have. And they're important for running of the business, but nobody really cares if we're out of flour or sugar if we've made all the donuts for the day and we're selling things just fine. Similarly, you could be running high CPU, but what does that actually mean for your business? I don't care if I'm running high CPU. If I'm on AWS, that means I'm getting the most out of my instance, so I'm not paying for any idle time. Similarly, if I'm running on-prem and I have high CPU and I don't have that extra bandwidth in case I have a spike, well, that could be bad. But again, I don't care to alert about those. I really want to alert on the business metrics, the things like, is there high latency on my web application? And then dig into the resource metrics. And then using the events, we can start to correlate those two. So events is anytime we have a code change or a scaling event, anytime an alert goes off. So we use all three of these to cycle down. So again, we start to alert on our work metrics. Latency is high on my web application. And then we dig into those resource metrics. Was that caused by high CPU or some sort of disk I/O issue? And then we look at the events. Was there a correlated code change? Was there a scaling event that scaled down when it shouldn't have to limit my resources? And you can keep recursing down until you find the contributing factors or the contributing technical causes behind what happened. So that's the technical side, and I think most of us are fairly familiar with that, if not with those specific terms. We all understand that we shouldn't be having alert fatigue because of really bad monitoring. But data-driven incident review really also has to include the human side, right? Because we are all human, and there is usually a human element. But one notice, if you are running a postmortem or an incident analysis, don't do that while you're still remediating an issue. A lot of times people try to do that. They're like, I know I need to remember this for later. Let's just start diving in. But if you're trying to do that, it's like a police officer who shows up at the scene of a traffic accident. Meanwhile, like cars are flying by him and they're exploding, and he's like there writing the citation to the person that crashed. You really want to stop the incident or stop the outage, remediate that before you dive into things. But as we talk about people, we should first talk about who. So who are the people that we should be talking to? And oftentimes I talk to people when they're running things or when they want advice about incident response, and they're like, everybody, we should get everybody in on the incident review. Everybody is a nice coverall, and it means we haven't actually thought about who should be a part of this. So I brought up the police officer. Let's continue with that sort of analogy. If we're thinking about a crime scene, who are the people that a police investigator would talk to? Well, we always think of the responders, right? The first responders, so the police that show up, the paramedics, the firefighters. And these are going to be, for our analogy, they're the engineers. So they're the engineers who helped fix the issue, who remediated the issue, who jumped in there and managed to get the server back online. And those are great people to talk to. But just like a police investigator wouldn't just talk to other police, they would talk to people like the witnesses, or the victims. So we have to think of how we can include other people in there, whether those are the identifiers, people that witnessed what was going on and have an outside objective opinion or perspective on things, and the affected users. If your incident was first noticed by your customers because they couldn't do something, those people have really valuable information. They have a perspective of how they saw an outage that's completely different from yours, because the outage for you looks like an alert from VictorOps or an alert from OpsGenie or something like that, which is very different from somebody who can't do something on your website, right? So gathering these different perspectives is really, really important. So we know who. What are we collecting? Well, we're collecting their perspectives. We want to know not only what people did and get an accurate timeline of the actions that occurred, but more importantly, we want to know what people thought and why they thought what they did. We want to gather the information that was available to people that informed their actions, because it's all about gathering more context. So if we can understand the information that people had, then hopefully we can build up that information, start to provide more information so that next time it'll inform them to make even better decisions and hopefully prevent repeats. One way to do this is have people write things down. I love this quote from Richard Gwindon that says, "Writing is nature's way of letting you know how sloppy your thinking is." It's really fantastic when you talk to someone and you're like, how did this incident happen? What did you see? And they explain things and you're like, that sort of makes sense. And then you're like, let's write this down as a story. And you see this clear gap of something that happened, and there's like a missing page in the novel of like this logical jump to something else. So having them write it down actually forces people to start making these logical connections. And when you have people write things down, another great thing is to start including pictures. Because I hate reading. Well, no, I mean, we all sort of hate reading, but pictures actually do express a lot more than words do. It's one thing for us to say that we saw a spike in latency. It's another thing to actually show the chart from our dashboard. So, at Datadog, we have a notebooks feature that you can easily export from your dashboards. But you could just take screenshots. Everybody has access to Google Docs to make their postmortems. Everybody has access to a screenshotting tool to just screenshot their dashboards. So start to include those. And then we have the when. So we talked about who and what. When should we start gathering this information? And really, it's as quickly as possible. We want to start gathering information because people's memories drop off sharply. Richard Ebbinghaus was the first real researcher on human memory well over 100 years ago, German fellow. And he noticed that the logarithmic curve of how our memory drops off really sharply within the first 20 minutes. So we want to get people's information as quickly as we can. Along with that, though, recent research in crime studies has shown that people's susceptibility to false memories increases on an inverse curve. So the longer we wait, the more people are susceptible to remembering things that didn't actually happen, or remembering things as they happened, or in a different way than they actually happened. One way to do this, though, a lot of people have problems getting their postmortems done in a timely manner. A good way to do this is to get your project managers involved. Right? Your project managers are the ones that are pushing you to get new features or to build new infrastructure. So it really is their job to prioritize the tasks of learning from what happens along with the building of things. So if they can help prioritize the learning, then you'll be under less pressure to just keep building without taking that time out. Some things that we do have to be aware of, though, as we gather things and as we wait some time is the susceptibility to data skew. Just like we have corruption with technical data, we have corruption with human data. So while getting things, reviewing things within the first 20 minutes can be really important, be aware that if you're remediating an issue, if you're bringing people in, they're probably under some stress. If it's frequent outages, they might have some sleep deprivation if they've worked all night. And they could be facing burnout if it's something that happens regularly. So be aware, be kind to your fellow employees or your coworkers. If they've been remediating an issue, be aware of their mental state. Maybe wait a little bit, but do try to get things done within those first 2 days. Other ways that we get data skew is from blame. Oftentimes we talk about blameless postmortems within this space, but blame is the #1 way that we get corrupted data. If we start blaming our coworkers, pointing fingers, even though we always know that Thomas is responsible, if it's always Thomas's fault, Thomas is never going to tell me the truth, right? And I want Thomas to tell me the truth so I can learn from that. Because if we're going to fire Thomas, he's going to just say that everything was fine, and he might point the finger to Tiago or Kareem or someone else. So getting rid of the blame helps us get more accurate information. Other ways that we have data skew, there's a ton of biases. I'm not going to jump into all these. If you go to Wikipedia, though, the page on logical fallacies and biases is huge. So being aware of them, though, being aware of things like hindsight bias and accusing people of why didn't you do this or you should have done something else. Understand that people try to make the best decisions that they can with the information that they have. So had they known that information, they would have made a different choice, which is why we're running incident reviews to begin with, is to try to get people that more information. So, all that said, at Datadog, we do postmortems, and we do it a lot. So I like to think that we're really good at it, and we are getting better all the time. But I figured I'd share how we do things, because I do think that we do them well, because we practice them well. A few notes before I jump into this. When we do postmortems, we email them company-wide. One of the things when you do postmortems or incident reviews is you want open transparency across your organization. That means not only having the information from an incident available to the teams that were involved, to the teams that were affected, but across an organization makes it widely available. And people in different engineering teams and different engineering organizations within your company can learn from them. More than that, there are people that are actually invested in this. For us, as we build a technical product, our salespeople are largely interested in our outages and our incidents. Because if a customer calls up and complains about something that happened at a certain time, it's worth their knowing that, well, there might have been an incident at that time, so they can help inform our customers. Similar to our sales and marketing people, they want to be able to respond to people that post on social media or other things. The other thing that we do is we schedule a recurring postmortem meeting. So every month we get together and we review all of the incidents that have happened and we share those. So if you didn't bother to check the emails or read up on it or you wanted more information, that's now available. This not only sets up a time where we can all learn from each other, but it sets up the perception or the expectation, rather. It sets up the expectation that we're all learning and that it's not a negative thing. We don't just run incident reviews when things go bad. We come together and we have them as a learning event. So within our postmortems or incident reviews, we have 5 main sections, and it starts with a summary of what happened. And it's just a high-level summary. We ask, what was the impact on customers? So again, keeping that customer perspective right up there at the top. And then we ask, what was the severity of the outage, what components were affected, and ultimately just a summary of what resolved it. And as I said before, we email this out company-wide, so if somebody in sales wants to know what happened, they can simply just read this and get a good TLDR, top-level view of what happened. An example from one of our incidents that happened last year. This was a pretty bad outage for us. So in the summary here, we can see a summary of what happened, increased latency, 500 errors. But again, including images, right? It's one thing for that second sentence there to say that it resulted in increased latency. It's another thing when you see this graph from Pingdom to see what latency increases looked like. More on that, though. Again, we include that impact on customers, the severity of the outage, the components affected. So again, for this one, when we look at that graph and we say increased latency, severity of the outage for this is major. The second part of our template is we ask, how was the outage detected? Right? The whole goal of running incident reviews is to learn, but it's to learn to get better, to respond faster. We won't always be able to prevent outages, but we want to be sure that we can detect them as quickly as possible and speed up the time that it takes to remediate them. So we asked, did we have a metric that showed the outage? Was there a monitor? So was there an automated alert on that metric? And then how long did it take for us to declare, right? So even if we have a metric and we have an automated alert, if nobody's declaring an outage and we have a delay there, that's something else that we want to pick up. So if I jump into our postmortem, did we have a metric that showed that outage? Yeah, we had a lot of them, actually. And so we have a link back here to our dashboard at that time, which would show that. Was there an automated alert? There was. There were actually a few. And then how long did it take? In this particular case last year, it took us about 3 minutes. So not too bad. We are getting better at this. And then again, including those images from your dashboards. It's really easy. Just take a screenshot. But it's so informative. So again, we have things like our Pingdom up there in the top left. But we can see latency across the board, and we can see how it just exploded. These are very, very useful versus just simple words. Part 3 of our 5-part template, how did we respond? So we want to start gathering that timeline of who was involved and how things progressed. So we asked who the incident owner was, who else was involved. This is where we start pulling in that information, sometimes about who noticed it or who was affected. And then Slack archives. If you're using a ChatOps tool, that's a great way for you to capture information without having to go and interview people about what they thought at a particular time. It's already there for you. And then more importantly, we ask what went well and what didn't go well. We want to ensure that the things that went well, we want to promote those actions and keep doing those. And the things that didn't go so well, you want to start to work on ways to fix that. So for this particular incident, we can see the people who were involved. We have a link to our Slack archives and a link to our dashboards and, again, our notebooks feature, which is one of our ways that we do postmortems, but that we also can take dashboards and include them with text. And then we have a basic timeline of events. Can't say it enough, though. It's really easy, particularly when you're all in one office, to go to a warm room, to take a conference room somewhere, gather everyone together, and you can talk. And talking is a really fast way of communicating, but you miss a lot, right? You'll never get that information back. So doing it over Slack, doing it over HipChat, doing it over whatever your chat tool is to gather that information can be really, really handy. Another thing, I said that you shouldn't try to postmortem or incident review while you're remediating an issue. But the great thing about chat tools is you can simply leave yourselves notes like this, right? Hashtag postmortem in Slack isn't actually a channel, but tag it with something, write the information that you need, and then Slack or HipChat, just quickly search for that tag that you have, and now you have all of this stuff that you reminded yourself of, so you can gather that all up later. Part 4 of our template is why did it happen? So we're all engineers, we're all technically minded. We want to capture that deep dive into the technical issues. So this section is pretty straightforward. Just lay out the technical issues. I'm not going to go deep into it, but we have published it on our status page, and also Alexi, our CTO, did a great presentation on it. And then finally, part 5 of our template. Part 5 is the most important, and it's how do we prevent this in the future? Or how do we start to build up resiliency in our systems? Number one thing here, though, is link to the GitHub issues, the Jira tickets, the Trello cards, whatever system you're using. You want to track these things to ensure that they get done. But the way that we like to break things up is to say 3 sections: now, next, and later. Now's the stuff that you really have to accomplish during this sprint cycle within the next day or 2. Otherwise, another issue will come up or the issue will repeat. Next is things that we can schedule for the next sprint cycle, things that we know that are important and we don't want to lose track of. Later, though, is something that I find to be the most important. These days, we're building systems so rapidly that sometimes we don't necessarily architect them in the greatest way or the best way. These issues are often lost. Later is our section for that. If we need to re-architect something, if we need to bring in multiple teams and coordinate how we're going to roll out or improve a feature, or even just change a feature, the later section is where you want to do that. You don't want to lose track of those, because if you do, you end up kicking the can down the road, just delaying on things that are serious, architectural decisions that eventually will just paint you into a corner, and you'll be stuck with all of this technical debt and this technical infrastructure debt. So you want to keep track of those. And then we have follow-up notes. So as we start to dive into these, you'll start to notice some issues, and you want to make notes of those and keep those within your incident reviews so that you can follow up on them and you can have all that information in one place. So we ask, how do we prevent it in the future? In this case, we had a link to our GitHub commit for the issue that got done. And as mentioned, we keep notes. So in this case, there was one issue that was assigned to Mira. She really didn't think it actually applied, so she added that note. So again, keeping those notes around. And this is just for the now section. So just to recap, as I'm almost out of time, 5 points of our incident review template. What happened as a summary? How did we detect it? How did we respond? Why did it happen? And the action steps are the most important. This is probably more important for you guys, though. I have the template online. Feel free to clone that. It's a Google Doc. And there's also a great article by John Allspaw, who sort of kicked off the blameless postmortems movement. He's got a great article about the infinite hows of how he investigates contributing factors. And with that, I'm done. This is actually the link to the slides, so if you want to download the entire deck, that's available.
Thank you, Jason. All right. We don't have super much time for questions, but I think we can squeeze one in if anyone has one. First hand up is going to get it. There you go. Watch out.
No books?
Be awake. Who said books?
You don't have books for them?
Maybe. But if there's one, it's kind of unfair.
Hi.
Hey.
I have one question about the work metrics versus resource metrics. If you are alerting only on work metrics, can you be proactive? Because if you have your monitoring and maybe alerting on resource metrics, you can have automation to scale up, for example. But looking at work metrics, how can you be proactive?
Yeah, so work metrics, you can be pretty proactive on those. One thing that we've got within our system, and I know that you can get other solutions out there, we have anomaly detection and outlier detection. So you can start applying either machine learning if you want to go whole hog on like intelligent systems. We use a lot of algorithms, but that's one way that we do it, is to actually start looking at the past history of a metric. And so that's, again, why I pointed out that good metrics should be long-lived. So you can see a history of where a metric's been and the patterns. So again, when you start to alert on those work metrics, you might start to see a spike. But if your system knows that in the past, it's a cron job that runs every Sunday that clears my caches and reprimes them, well, then your system should be intelligent enough to say that this spike is just normal. So yeah, keeping those metrics around for a long time is important for alerting on those work metrics. And then trying to build intelligent systems. So that's something that you should be looking for in a monitoring system, or pulling in another system to start analyzing your metrics.
All right, that was unfortunately all we had time for, but thank you for your question. And thank you again to Jason.
Yeah.